I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 29th episode of this podcast where we like to talk about everything that you can possibly do to improve your brain and make yourself that teensy-weensy little bit smarter that we all would like to be. This episode is dedicated in big, broad strokes to the very idea of being smarter, and appropriately enough, our interview subject is the author of a book just released titled Smarter. We're going to be talking with author Dan Hurley in just a couple of minutes here, and he's going to give us his impressions on what he learned during the course of over a year of researching every single gosh darn way that people are trying to make themselves smarter these days. And he's looked into quite a few of the things that we've talked about on this show. And at the risk of giving away the punchline or the secret or the surprise ending or whatever, he feels that he definitely has made himself smarter over the course of doing the research and the self-experimentation that went into putting that book together. And as if that wasn't bait enough to keep listening, we've got the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, which is going to tell you about something that I read about recently, which is a new and very exciting finding about how to give adults the learning powers that normally vanish after the age of like 7, 8, 9, 10. We all know that kids learn really super well. They've recently found something which might turn back the clock a little bit and give older people a chance to learn really well as well. But before we get into any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So scientists at Oxford University have found a region of the brain that appears to be responsible for keeping track of decisions that we almost made but didn't quite make. They call it the lateral frontal pole, and it's apparently about the same size as a large Brussels sprout. For those of you familiar with the size of large Brussels sprouts, I don't know why they chose that as the example for the size. I mean, it seems like golf ball, something like that. I don't know how big is a Brussels sprout. But anyway, this part of the brain keeps track of the decisions that you came close to making. You chose something else, but then you kind of need to reflect back on the decision that you might have made for learning purposes or thinking what you should do next time. It kind of allows feelings of things like guilt or the grass is greener syndrome, all those sorts of kind of uniquely human, almost conscience-esque mental behaviors. Professor Matthew Rushworth says this region monitors how good the choices are that we don't take. And I hadn't known that this was what this area of the brain was doing before. Obviously, brains switch hit all sorts of tasks, so anything the size of a Brussels sprout is probably doing a lot of different things, but this is one of the things that this area does. And this region is only present in humans, not monkeys. It's part of the neocortex region, which humans have a very big one of, and nothing else gets any of it all. It's kind of unique to humans. We've actually got one frontal lateral pole behind each eyebrow, so we got one on each side of our brain. So the next time that you are in a spirited debate with a monkey or sitting at a bar with a monkey and talking about like the one that got away or, oh, if I could have been a contender, you know that you've got the upper hand in that conversation because any other animal but a human just does not have the same way of looking back on past deeds, whether deeds or misdeeds, I guess is up to us to decide.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I first came across Dan Hurley by an article he wrote about transcranial direct current stimulation, I don't know, probably about 3 months ago or so when I was doing a little bit of research for that episode. He had gotten transcranial direct current stimulation, which is a hard thing to say fast, and wrote an article about it, and I looked up the byline, and lo and behold, he was writing a book called Smarter, which we are now about to talk with him about. Smarter, I have actually read cover to cover, and it's a very interesting read. Dan basically follows his own adventures, sort of investigating the world of how one makes oneself smarter, so very apropos for this audience. However, in fairness to the title of this podcast being about smart drugs, he doesn't really go into smart drugs at all because he didn't want to do anything that he wasn't sure about the safety consequences of. And I think a lot of the things that we were considering in the realm of smart drugs, he just didn't feel like had been borne out by long enough time on the market to really see what the long-term effects are for people. And interestingly, one of the things that I think we don't talk about in the coming interview, but was a really interesting one, is according to his research, he thinks that the only two foods which have really been shown to quantitatively improve humans' intelligence are number one, coffee, and number two, breast milk for infants. And both of those, he thinks that the data behind them is pretty compelling, but everything else he was, including fish oil even, he was not terribly impressed by. So with that as preamble, Dan Hurley, author of Smarter.
Smart Drug Smarts.
There are three basic kinds of intelligence. The term we've all heard lately is emotional intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we all know about the importance of being sensitive to feelings to others' feelings, being able to read understand what other people are going through, and being able to have some level of control over that, so you're not freaking out and yelling or misunderstanding people, and being able to work well with with yourself and with others. So that's a really important form of intelligence, and lots of people have come to think of the old-fashioned intelligence as not so important, right? They'll say, oh, IQ, that's just a crock. That doesn't really matter. So it turns out that old-fashioned basic intelligence is really important, and it's even important for emotional intelligence. There's a reason why a lot of people in prison are lower IQ folks, and why when you meet an engineer or a Google person, they're often super low-key. It's because, you don't have 30 brains. You have one brain, and it all works together, and your ability to control your thoughts is very closely related to your ability to control your emotions. So in standard old-fashioned intelligence, there's two kinds. There's crystallized intelligence. That's your memory of facts, how to ride a bike, how to fix your plumbing, your knowledge of words, your basic procedures and facts. And most of us focus on that as we're getting older. If you don't remember your pal's name when you bump into him at a concert and suddenly you don't remember this person's name, if you're forgetting where you left your keys, this is all crystallized kind of information that people get very focused on. And it's useful, it's important, but it's actually not as important as fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is your ability to manipulate and figure things out in your mind. It's your ability to learn, your ability to get to the heart of things, to understand. So the reason when kids who are having trouble in school are not learning things, are not building up that crystallized intelligence, is because their fluid intelligence is challenged. So they're having trouble focusing and getting it, what the heck the teacher's saying. Mm-hmm. So fluid and crystallized intelligence are the two main kinds.
And how does working memory play into that? Because I know working memory is another term that kind of was segregated off from fluid intelligence as a related but not exactly the same sort of subdivision.
So for about 15 years, psychologists have been focusing on this relationship between working memory and fluid intelligence. And the reason is, fluid intelligence is a little hard. It's a bit of a will-o'-the-wisp to get hold of. Many psychological constructs are like this. They're hard pinned down with a simple test, right? Mm-hmm. And working memory is a bit more simple. It's your ability in a matter of seconds to juggle information in your mind, to manipulate facts and figures, to be able to take something you're trying to remember, put it aside from your attention for a moment, think of something else, then pull that other thing back in. One way to describe it is if I ask you to remember 29734. Most people can do that really easily. So then the question is, how come, if that's so easy, multiplying 29 times 54 is so hard, mm-hmm. right? It's because you're manipulating the information. And if you do literally try to multiply 29 times 54, okay, so most of us are going to do the 9 times the 4. Yeah. Now we're going to get, what do you get? And then you put the one number down on the bottom and you got to carry the other. And now you got to multiply this one and remember what was the number that you put there. It's mind-boggling, right?
Right.
So that is a fundamental ability to follow and keep track of things moment to moment to moment.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, something like that, it's like you want to pull out a piece of paper and it's like it's so easy to do it by paper, but you're kind of using the fact that you're writing down these little scribbles to keep track of things that would fall out of your own mental RAM if you try to do it all in your head.
Your mental RAM is a very good idea. It's something that even working memory can be manipulated with emotional element. If something is literally like a life or death matter and you're suddenly intensely interested in this thing, you're going to be a lot better than if you're kind of yawning and not so interested.
Sure.
So it is possible to affect that to some degree with your own normal abilities. The real catch is that working memory and fluid intelligence, for 15 years, researchers said these two are very, very, very closely related. And in fact, this one researcher, Randy Engel of Georgia Tech, began publishing studies showing that they're so closely related that they're almost impossible to see a difference sometimes. You can really see that there's maybe not exactly the same, but very, very close. Mm-hmm. 100 years of research have said you cannot increase your fluid intelligence. It's impossible to do. And people have tried many, many, many things to do this. The whole movement toward preschool in many ways is aimed at making kids, literally smarter. Mm-hmm. It's not just that in preschool you're learning, okay, what are the colors and what's ABC, but really people have hoped that this is going to empower kids as they grow to be able to learn better in school. And if you can learn better, you're smarter, right?
Right.
And what they found over the course of the 1970s and the 1980s was method after method did not hold up, or it delivered benefits so tiny as to be hardly worth a year or two of expensive interventions, mm-hmm. right? Like if all you're gaining is 3 IQ points after I just spent a year with you on a daily 6-hour-a-day intervention that cost the government maybe $20,000 or $30,000, that's a pretty paltry
return on investment. Yeah.
So that's why when this guy Torkel Klingberg was doing some research back at the beginning of the 21st century, he was doing brain studies of working memory, and he found that no matter which kind of task he challenged a child with in working memory, it all seemed to activate the same region of the brain. And he found himself wondering, well, if all these different working memory tasks are being managed by one part of the brain, what if you practice one working memory task? Would you get better at another one? And the answer should have been no, because people have said that there is no transfer of things you learn. People have found this guy Anders Ericsson, who's widely known today because of Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers.
10,000-hour rule guy.
Yeah. So basically he said that if you learn the piano, you're no better at anything else. If you learn memory tricks that allow you to remember on the spot 100 numbers in a row, you are still no better than average at remembering letters. You will remember only about 7. So when that was shown, people said, okay, you can't train people to get more competent at general skills. It's all about work, baby. Torkel Klingberg ran this study. He used ADHD kids, and he also wondered if this kind of training would affect their attention deficit. And after just some 10, 20 hours of training, he found it significantly improved other working memory skills. It significantly improved their attention deficit, and it increased their fluid intelligence. So when his study came out, he was a young researcher. It was published in not the most prominent journal. A couple other researchers named Susan Yaki and Martin Bushko, who at that time were based in Switzerland, they read it, and they were interested in training, but they assumed what everybody else assumed, that it's very, very, very hard to do. They read this study and said, no, this is impossible. This can't work. The guy must have done something wrong, and let's prove it, and we're going to do a study that we attempt to replicate it, and we'll design it a little more carefully and see what happens. In the middle of that, they moved to the University of Michigan, and they then ended up publishing a study in one of the top journals, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and they found that doing a working memory task for up to 19 hours resulted in up to a 40% gain in fluid intelligence. This study was accompanied by an editorial by one of the most prominent psychologists in the country, Robert Sternberg, which said increasing fluid intelligence is possible after all. So this was a really big deal,
yeah, it's
right?
Like a bombshell.
This was the equivalent of saying you can get stronger by training physically.
Mm-hmm.
And of course you can. That's what the U.S. military does for every recruit. That's what boot camp is, right? Make them stronger and tougher. And therefore, the U.S. military has been funding research. The Office of Naval Research, IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Project Agency, which is the equivalent of DARPA, but for the intelligence community, they're funding it. There have been about 75 studies published around the world on training methods, and they've all found the same thing, that intense but relatively brief training methods can substantially enhance your cognitive abilities. It's really, the phrase a revolution in science is widely overused, but this is truly a revolution in science, because if it's true that we can help people who are middle-aged, if we can help kids, if we can help people who are cognitively disabled with Down syndrome or ADHD, if we can help elderly folk who are trying to hang on to their independence with straightforward, brief training methods that don't take 3 years,
mm-hmm.
it's a really big deal for the world. And, I just find it so exciting to have been reporting on this for my book. It's been incredible to watch this research unfold as I've been reporting. I've attended a lot of meetings where some of these major studies were presented. I've watched researchers arguing with each other, and sometimes it's like watching Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other.
One of the things I actually wanted to ask about there was, you mentioned Engel as one of the researchers.
Yes.
Who he almost kind of comes off in your book as somewhat the villain. He's the guy who really digs in his heels and doesn't want to believe that fluid intelligence can be improved by really any of the techniques we're talking about. Why do you think some people are so fixated on intelligence not being something that we're capable of improving, despite the fact that we know so much about the plasticity of the brain?
Common sense tells you that if 100 years of studies found that nothing really works, you should really take that into account. And Randy Engel, being one of the more prominent researchers in the country, his studies have been among the most cited in psychology. He is being careful and diligent, and he doesn't want to start turning something into the next kooky dietary supplement that turns out not to work.
Sure.
He wants to be sure this is real. He looked at that 2008 paper very carefully. He really reverse engineered it and looked at how Yockey and Bushkill had done it. And he found a bunch of flaws. And I think it's legitimate to say that that was not a perfectly designed study. And if that were the only study, I would say we would have very shaky grounds to stand on. Since then, though, there have been about 75 other studies all finding similar things.
And this is all since 2008 that this sort of plume of new studies has taken place?
A few of them were before that. People have been doing this with physical exercise. Physical exercise is a great way to improve people's cognitive abilities. Mm-hmm. It has apparently been confirmed that the brain is connected to the rest of the body via the neck. And I mean, that's still, they're not 100% sure, but it seems so. When you're doing exercise, you're helping your brain get stimulated, and it has effects that are really substantial and almost as good as just about any other method, it seems. With elderly people, this has especially been shown. But you take a kid who is doing nothing but hanging out, watching TV, playing video games, and, and doing schoolwork, but if you get them to do physical exercise, studies have shown that they can really benefit and do better in the classroom. It's really a shame, in fact, that so many schools have really
are cutting
dropped
physical education for budgetary reasons
it's
and things like that.
So Randy Engold is just a skeptic. He is all about great procedures for carrying out studies. He knows how to do this. And I think to some degree, as the guy who really made a point of showing that fluid intelligence and working memory were so closely related, I think he felt that his turf was invaded by people who said, well, then if you increase working memory, you should be able to increase fluid intelligence. Mm-hmm. And that's where he kind of went, whoa, wait a minute, I never said that. And so he's devoted himself to picking apart a lot of studies. And, psychology it's not physics, not where they have $1 billion to construct a giant tunnel underneath the mountain.
Sure.
You propose a study, you recruit 100 people or maybe just 50 people, and you do it as carefully as possible, and you run statistical measures, but it can be open. People were complex, and psychologists can fool themselves. One thing really fascinating is Randy and his fellow arch skeptics, most of whom have come from Georgia Tech. Uh-huh. They first insisted that working memory training does absolutely nothing. Their most recent study, published in December, found that it actually does help improve other kinds of working memory, which if you can improve general working memory, that's a huge deal. That's still, no matter whether it's related to fluid intelligence or not, being able to control and enhance your working memory is a really useful ability. They found it did that. They did not see any gain in fluid intelligence. And Randy likes to measure fluid intelligence with multiple measures. He likes to use 5, 6, 7 measures. And things start getting a little tougher to do. It's harder to find things when you start casting multiple spotlights on it. But other researchers using his exact same method have found gains. So I think at this point, to believe that there's no benefit from these training methods, really, if you were a jury in a murder trial, you would say it's beyond a reasonable doubt. I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt. I think it's possible that it might all prove that 75 studies were a bunch of nonsense, but I'd be shocked. And I think really what most researchers are doing now are trying to find out what are the best methods and what are the methods for individual people, what works best with someone with ADHD, what works best with elderly people, with kids, with the middle-aged, and so on.
Sure. Well, I think also something that is worth coming back to is you mentioned that the sort of groundbreaking study by Suzanne Yaki was in a really short period of time. How many hours were put towards the effects?
Just 19 hours.
Yes.
Just 19 hours. And that seems crazy, but a study just came out in January. I mean, just last week. This is a study where they worked with elderly people and did cognitive training for just 10 hours. 10 hours. They just came up with their 10-year follow-up data. This has involved thousands of people. It's a randomized placebo-controlled trial. They had some people given the cognitive training that they knew would work. They had other people given kind of a pretend training that they assumed would not help. And they found 10 years later that the people that received the beneficial cognitive training still showed benefits over the people that got the placebo training.
Wow.
I mean, that's incredible. 10
hours of work 10 years later. Yeah, that's really incredible.
That's ridiculous. It seems impossible. It really, honestly, that seems impossible. And I think someone like Randy, is a useful voice to say, how can that be? Isn't that impossible? Honestly, I think what folks believe at this point is that it's like riding a bicycle, some of these skills, that once you learn it, you're better. And that's that. You're better able to use your mind as if you're riding a bike. And if that's the case, it's really extraordinary. And you would think instead of just giving out flu shots to every elderly person, Medicare would start assuring that these folks all get a mere 10 hours of cognitive training.
So if these things are generalizable, something like dual and back can be generalized to other forms of intelligence, that's great. But there's also, very clearly practice on specific things is a surefire way to get better at those specific things. So that wouldn't necessarily be what we would consider intelligence. Spending the 10,000 hours to become really, really good at piano isn't going to make you a really, really good violinist. But on the other hand, if you want to get good at something specifically versus getting smart generally, which is going to translate to being a little bit better at everything, where do you feel like sort of the return on investment threshold is on a person, with limited time? At what point would you say, well, it's better to study this specific thing, even if the skills don't transfer, versus trying to make yourself generally smarter?
There's no question that if you want to be a good musician, you better work, baby. Mm-hmm. And a lot of studies have shown that the accomplishment of the top performers is very closely related to how much practice they've put in, how many hours have they worked at it. And I think that's true of everything. If you want to be a writer, a lot of people will say, I want to be a writer. And then you say, well, how much time have you put in? They go, well, I do it when I'm inspired. Well, that's fine, but that is not going to help you get where you want to be. I know I personally, as a journalist and writer, have spent, my life reading and writing. And, I used to leave my friends in high school and say, oop, I got to go work on this story I'm writing. And that's what I've been doing my whole life. And if you want to accomplish anything at a high level, you need to be working at that very hard. The harder you work, the better you're going to do. I don't know that Thomas Edison, who he said, genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. And I don't think he was kidding around.
I always thought that quote was Woody Allen, but okay, it's good to know that was Edison.
No, Woody Allen said it's showing up.
Right.
Yeah. When they say, how do you get into Carnegie Hall? And the answer is practice, 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 right? Mm-hmm. So the question is, how come there are students in a music school who practice all as hard as each other, and some of them do better? How come? How come these people that want to get into Google, right, work for Google, and they have been doing programming since they were 9 years old and working away at it, how come they don't all get hired? How come everybody isn't as good as each other?
Yeah, or the child prodigies that haven't had the opportunity to put 10,000 hours into anything.
We all know hard workers. If the race always goes to the runner who tried the hardest and trained the most, then the Olympics, we would know in advance who's going to win based only on how hard they train.
Sure.
And that's not the case. There are people who are better at things than others. We have differing abilities. And what is cool about cognitive training and trying to improve your fluid intelligence and your working memory is that it increases your ability and it increases your capacity to learn, to benefit from training, so that if you work hard, you will should be able to learn more and benefit more from all that sweat you put in.
So thank you very much to Dan Hurley for joining us for that conversation and for writing a very readable and interesting book. I mean, the fact that the book led to Dan's being able to, within a 3-month period, notably increase his own intelligence, both sort of subjectively and backed up by the test that he took to quantitatively verify that, is, I think, something that should be really inspiring to everybody listening to this. It certainly was to me. I did finish the book within, I think, 24 hours of concluding this interview. So, I was reading the book as fast as I could to try to, get it all read before the interview. Didn't quite make my cutoff, but it was enough of a page turner that even after the interview was concluded, I just had to know how it ended. And the good guys win in the end. Hopefully that's not a spoiler. Moving right along to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Okay, so we all know that little kids are conspicuously good at learning things. They can learn things like languages without developing annoying accents that we get when we try to learn languages as adults and things like that. Basically, their little minds are sponges, to use the analogy that everybody always uses. The mind really isn't much like a sponge, but what it is when kids are young is it's very, very plastic in the sense that it is able to quickly rewire giant chunks of itself to kind of handle whatever reality is throwing at the young brain. And this plasticity tends to diminish with age. One example of such things is perfect pitch. Kids can apparently be trained more or less to get perfect pitch, but it's believed previously that by the time you're an adult, you either have it or you don't. It's not really something that a 40-year-old is going to get perfect pitch or be able to develop that. Or so we thought. A study by Takeo Hench, who were trying to get on this show for an interview. He's a professor of molecular and cellular biology at Harvard, and he's been studying the use of something called valproic acid. Valproic acid is used to treat neurological disorders like seizures and epilepsy, but he did a learning experiment with it on several adult males between the ages of 18 and 27, and apparently was able, with the application of valproic acid and 2 weeks of training, to train these adult males who did not have perfect pitch to essentially pop out the other end of that training cycle with perfect pitch. So this is a pretty big deal. I wouldn't necessarily recommend looking up the chemical formula for valproic acid and going into your basement and trying to make it just yet, because it's just one study and these things sometimes aren't all they're cracked up to be, but it certainly was pretty amazing finding at first blush. And so we're really looking to find out more about this, and we'll get an episode devoted to valproic acid as soon as we can.
Smart Drug Smarts.
You heard it. That is the episode. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends. And if you're feeling particularly generous and wish to leave us a review on iTunes, that'd be awesome too. I would like to point out a little bit of a self-congratulatory backslapping, obnoxious though it may be, coming right now. We've actually gotten 4 episodes of Smart Drug Smarts out during the month of January 2014, so we are on pace to actually be the weekly podcast that I always intended us to be. This is in no small part due to the Herculean efforts of one Ben Pomeroy, who's filling the pipeline with the excellent interview guests that we are lucky enough to have on this show. So hopefully Ben will drop in a round of applause sound for himself, because he certainly deserves it. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here. I will be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.